Do I need public cloud or private cloud? Is every single one of my critical processes actually covered in this bill of materials? And what about the parts that SAP doesn't do? Where do all of those fit in? If you're answering these three questions with a PowerPoint slide or a gut feeling, you are about to make a very expensive mistake. The most dangerous document in your SAP implementation isn't the initial SAP software contract, and it isn't the system integrator statement of work. It's the unbudgeted addendum that you will have to sign 3 weeks after the kickoff. And we've all been there. The contract is signed, the champagne is popped, and then your solution architect opens the hood and says, "Hey, we're a subscription business. Why is the entitled management license missing from the BOM?" And you look at the contract and it's not there. You check the public cloud feature list and it's not supported. Boom. That's where you start to panic. Now you have a crisis on two fronts. You have to go back to the CFO for more money to pay SAP for the missing license. And you have to explain to the steering committee why the system integrator is charging you a change request for the project delay. Now the trust is broken before you've even configured a single screen. And why does that happen? It happens because SAP executives often assume the business operating model. They look at your industry label, automotive or retail, and they just apply a generic template. They don't see your specific operations and they don't see the nuances of your supply chain. And they certainly don't account for the white spaces, that is, the areas that SAP doesn't cover. So you end up with a bomb based on a theoretical company and not your company. Today, we stop guessing. I'm going to show you the SAP Digital Discovery Assessment, the DDA, and this is the truth machine. It is the only tool that mathematically answers the public versus the private debate and validates your process coverage and flags exactly what SAP won't do. By the end of this video, you will know how to use the DDA to build a bulletproof contract, kill your scope creep, and sleep at night knowing your BOM actually matches your business. So let's get into it. So, how do we fix this? Enter the SAP Digital Discovery Assessment. But let me be brutally honest with you. The DDA is a tool, it's not a consultant, and it's definitely not a magic wand. The DDA has a hard boundary and it only knows what SAP knows. Well, it has its blind spots and it cannot see your legacy systems, it cannot see your niche third party logistics software. And it doesn't know that your standard billing process actually involves three different non SAP systems. Now, if you just hand the DDA to a junior admin and say, fill this out, they will click yes and no until the screen turns green, and they will generate a technically valid SAP bomb that completely fails your actual business. And this is where the business expert becomes the most important person in the room. To win at this, you need a human who understands the business operating model first and the software second. You need someone who can look at the DDA and say, okay, SAP covers 80% of this process here, but the DDA doesn't cover this specific industry nuance in the, let's say, warehouse. So I'm marking this out of scope in the DDA, and we are going to handle this with a best of breed partner solution. Now, the DDA doesn't solve the puzzle for you. It just gives you the SAP pieces. You, the business architect, are the one who decides which pieces to use and, crucially, which pieces to throw away. So consider the DDA as a calculator, but you have to be the mathematician. Let's look at how an expert actually drives this tool to build a real world architecture. So, hi, I'm Noel Benjamin Dcosta. I don't deal in theory. I've been rescuing ERP and AI projects that bought into the dream and woke up as a nightmare. And I've seen what happens when you sign a contract without understanding the fine print. I've seen what happens when you ignore data until it's too late. And through this video, I'm going to show you how not to be the next casualty. So when you open the tool, The process begins with a quick qualification. So most sales reps treat this section like an administrative data entry. They rush through it to get to the real questions. And so don't do that. Don't treat this section as a form. It is the GPS destination for your entire project. So if you punch in the wrong coordinates here, you will arrive at the wrong destination, no matter how well you drive. So let me tell you three stories to explain why this matters. So I once reviewed a deal for a high-tech company and they sold medical software and maintenance contracts. Naturally, the sales rep selected professional services as the industry. And the DDA said, great, you are a service company, and it hid all the heavy manufacturing questions to keep the interface clean. But here's the twist. The company also refurbished old hardware in a warehouse. So they took the old units, they kind of stripped them apart, and what they were doing was they were rebuilding them. This is manufacturing because they picked the wrong industry label. The DDA never asked them about refurbishment orders. The bomb was generated without the manufacturing engine. And they went to the kickoff and tried to model the refurbishment process and then hit a wall. And they had bought a service ERP for a manufacturing problem. Let's talk about the second example. So this is the number one cause of surprise costs. So let's picture a CEO who tells you, we are a US company, we have a few sales guys in Latin America. And so you select USA in the DDA and you skip the rest. 6 months later, the implementation discovers that the sales office in Brazil actually issues legal invoices, the nota fiscal. And if you do not select Brazil in the DDA, the system does not trigger the localization SKUs. Suddenly, you have a system that works perfectly in English and is illegal in Portuguese. You're scrambling now for a change request to add the Brazil country version, which triggers a massive regression test. And the DDA doesn't warn you about this. It assumes you've told the truth. So we'll talk about the third example, and this is the most dangerous one. This is the public versus private cloud war. Now, based on your inputs, the DDA is going to give you a recommendation, and it will calculate the data and say, this client fits best in Grow with SAP, which is the public cloud. Now, here is where the expert actually earns their fee. The DDA is looking at data. It is not looking at culture. I had a client whose processes were 100% standard on paper. The DDA screamed public cloud, and I knew their VP of finance was going to have an objection. I knew he had been using the same custom report for 20 years and refused to change it. I knew their culture was high touch, low adaptability. Moreover, the calculation of standard costs for some of their products required some level of custom logic which the public cloud could not address. Now, if I had blindly followed the DDA's recommendation for public cloud, I would have sold a rigid, standardized solution to a client. And that project would have failed. The DDA gives you a recommendation. You make the decision. So once you lock these boundaries in, whether it is industry or geography and addition, the DDA generates the specific catalog of questions for the next phase. Now that we have the right map, let's go into the engine room, which is the detailed discovery. This is where the DDA presents you with the functional deep dive. So this could be for finance, supply chain, manufacturing, R&D. Now, here is the danger. The DDA is programmed with SAP standard logic. So it acts like a really eager waiter who wants to upsell you on the specials. So it asks questions presuming you want to do things the premium way. So if you hand this tool to someone who is afraid of making a mistake, they will fall into the $1,000,000 yes trap. They click yes on everything that sounds vaguely familiar just to be safe. Now, let me give you a real example of how this bloats your contract. So let's talk about the advanced trap. So I was in a scoping session for a mid-sized distributor. We reached the supply chain section and the DD asked, do you require advanced availability checks based on your product allocation? So the sales rep's eyes lit up. He thought, Well, they distribute products, they check availability, that's a yes. The DDA logic engine triggered. It identified the scope item IJW and it added the advanced supply chain SKU to the BOM, which is an expensive license. So I paused the room. I turned to the warehouse manager, the guy who has been running the floor for 20 years, and I asked him, forget the software for a second. When you have a shortage, do you run a complex algorithm to prioritize customer A over customer B, or do you just ship it to whoever's ordered first? He laughed. He said, we don't have time for algorithms. We do first in, first out. If it's on the shelf, it goes on the truck. Now, that is the moment of truth. Because if we had to click yes, we would have sold them a Ferrari engine for a bicycle process. They would have paid for advanced ATP and never used it. So I clicked no. So the DDA reverted to the SAP standard ATP and it removed the expensive SKU. We relied on the core license and we saved the client money and we matched the software to their actual maturity level. Let's look at another example. The second story illustrates an even more dangerous trap. So the DDA is a closed loop. It is programmed to ask things about SAP S/4HANA that it can do. It's not programmed to ask things that it cannot do. So I worked for a steel manufacturer, and their most critical process was trim optimization, calculating how to cut a massive steel coil into small strips with minimal waste. And we went through the DDA and we answered hundreds of questions around finance, purchasing, and sales, and everything felt great. The DDA turned green, but the DDA never asked them, do you need a trim optimization algorithm? Why? Because SAP S/4HANA doesn't do that standard. So if you're just reading the questions on the screen, you will think, well, the DDA didn't bring it up, so I guess it's included in manufacturing. Wrong. You will walk away thinking that you are covered only to find on day one that your core business process is missing. So the business expert looks at the screen and notices the silence. They look at the questions and they realize, wait, I don't see trim optimization here. This is a white space. This is a gap. And they mark it out of scope in the DDA. And they immediately write a requirement for a partner solution or a custom BTP app. This is the lesson. You use the DDA to define what goes into your SAP contract, but you must also use your own expertise to define what stays out. You're carving the scope, not just compiling a list. So once you've navigated these hundreds of decision points, dodging the upsells and filling the blind spots, the DDA generates the verdict. So let's look at what the output looks like, right? So you've set the boundaries, you've navigated the minefield of questions. Congratulations. Now the DDA hands you the verdict. So you get the solution map. Now, most people scroll straight to the bottom to see the final BOM list. Don't do that. There are two specific tabs in this report that are the difference between a successful go live and a lawsuit. The first one is the outer scope tab. Now, I call this your legal sheet. So let me tell you an example about the Treasury issue that I once had. I was on a project where we reached the user acceptance testing and the final hurdle before go live. The CFO walked into the room, sat down on the keyboard, and said, okay, show me the Treasury hedging module. Now, the room went dead silent, and the consultants looked at each other. So the project manager turned pale, and the CFO started screaming, we're a global company. How can you have forgotten Treasury? In the old days, it would have been the end of the project manager's career. It would have become a he said, she said battle. But this time we had the DDA. So I opened the DDA report from 6 months prior. I navigated to the outer scope tab, and right there in black and white was the line item J77, Treasury Management Status Rejected. Date, January 12th, the approver, the CFO himself. Now, the screaming stopped instantly. It turned an emotional argument into a factual record. So the DDA proved that the scope wasn't forgotten, it was decided. So second is the BOM mismatch check, and this is the lie detector. So this tab compares the calculated BOM, what the math said you needed, against the manual proposal, what the sales rep was trying to sell. And I'll give you a story of the discount disaster. So I audited a failed project where the system kept crashing. It was slow, it was timing out, and we looked at the DDA. The DDA's technical math had calculated that based on their transaction volume, they needed around 128 gigs of HANA memory. But when we looked at the manual proposal column, the sales rep had overridden it to 64 gigs. Why? Because he had a budget cap. He wanted to close the deal, so he artificially lowered the specs to make this price look better. Now, the DDA had screamed about this and it displayed a bright red warning: system proposal versus manual proposal mismatch. But nobody looked at it. So they signed the cheaper contract and they bought a system that was physically incapable of running their business. So the business expert treats this screen as the final gate. So if you see red on this screen, stop everything. Do not sign. It means the commercial deal which you're paying for is fighting the technical reality of what you need. You force the commercial team to respect the technical math. You do not proceed until those two columns are aligned. And this is how you ensure the contract isn't just signed, but it is actually viable. This is the one final piece of the puzzle that sits outside of the core software but acts like a hidden tax on your entire project, which is integration. So we spend months obsessing over the ERP core: finance, manufacturing, and sales. And we treat the ERP like it's the king of the castle, but we forget that the king needs to talk to the villagers. So if you have a third party logistics provider, the 3PL, or if you're using Salesforce or for CRM, or you're using Primavera, or you're using Concur, you just can't assume that these connections will happen. You have to license the plumbing. So I once worked on a project. I was called in as an advisor later on when the SAP build was perfect. So the finance team was happy, the sales team was happy. On go live morning, the first sales order was confirmed and it was entered. So the system confirmed it, the inventory was allocated, the delivery document was created. Everybody cheered. But 2 hours later, the warehouse manager called: "Hey guys, the trucks are here, but the scanners are dead. We haven't received a single order." And there was panic, and we traced the data. The message had left as for HANA and it hit a wall. Why? Because the warehouse was run by a 3PL that required a very specific EDI translation. And to do that translation, we needed the SAP BTP integration suite. But because the project manager had skipped the integration scoping in the DDA, that license was not in the POM. So we had a multi-million dollar ERP that couldn't send a simple text file to the warehouse next door. So we had to issue an emergency change request to buy the integration suite. I told them we have to rush through the contract through procurement. Of course, I was there to help them, and we got it at the right price. The warehouse was dark for 3 days. The DDA prevents this. If you use it, now the DDA had a specific tab called integration scoping, and it asks you what systems are you connecting to. If you list your 3PL or your HR system or your banks, the DDA calculates the API volume and it adds the necessary connectors and the traffic licenses to your BOM. Now, if you leave this tab blank, the DDA assumes you're running a standalone system on a desert island, and it gives you zero integration licenses. Now, the business expert knows an isolated ERP is a useless ERP. You must use the DDA to map the entire landscape, not just the SAP box. Now, if the data moves, the license needs to support it. So, here is the bottom line. There are two ways to build an SAP contract. You can either build it on Optimism, hoping that the standard template fits your business, or you can build it on data using the digital discovery assessment. But as we've seen today, data without wisdom is dangerous. The DDA is a powerful calculator, but it is not a consultant. It provides the science, the logic, the dependencies, the hard rules of what SAP can and cannot do. You, the business expert, provides the art, the context, the culture, and the realities of the shop floor. Now, the DDA knows that the scope item requires an advanced license, but only an expert knows if the warehouse team is actually ready to use it. So the DDA knows that SAP doesn't do steel coil optimization, but only an expert knows that this gap needs to be filled in by a partner, and it's not ignored. This is exactly where I come in. I spent my career sitting in these rooms. I've navigated hundreds of these assessments, and I know where the standard traps are hidden. And I know how to spot the white spaces that actually the sales teams miss. So, if you are a project manager, a solution architect, or a CIO, and you're staring at a contract right now thinking, I hope we didn't miss anything, stop. Hope is not a strategy. Here is my offer to you. If you are currently in the pre sales phase and you want a second pair of eyes on your digital discovery assessment, someone who isn't trying to sell you the software but is trying to save your project, reach out to me. Let's review your out of scope tab together. Let's audit that bomb mismatch. Let's make sure you aren't signing a change request in disguise. I've dropped a link in the description where you can contact me directly. But here is the warning. Even if we get your contract 100% perfect today, you still have a massive problem waiting for you tomorrow. You have 15 years of data, custom Z codes, and bad habits sitting in your old SAP ECC system. And right now, someone is probably telling you just do a brownfield conversion. It's easy, it's just an upgrade. Well, that's a lie because moving bad processes into a new contract doesn't make you agile, it just makes you fail faster. So, in the next video, we are tackling the beast, moving from SAP ECC to S4HANA. And I'm going to show you why lifting and shifting is a trap and how to prepare your data so you just don't move your trash into your new house. Click here to watch that video right now, and I'll see you there.